Jefferson Jr. would write about something like this if it wasn't true. In 2017, archaeologists conducted excavations as part of a restoration effort for the Monticello plantation. What they discovered seemed to support the rumors that have been swirling around our third president's legacy for centuries. This time around, they were aware of what Jefferson's grandson had written about in his diary. As they worked to uncover the original layout of the Monticello South Wing, they finally discovered what Jefferson's grandson had referred to in his diary. It had gone unnoticed for years, which was surprising given its location. Oddly, it was in the very place that had been renovated over and over, behind the bathroom. Knocking down the men's bathroom, which had been uneventfully renovated several times by now, the team discovered a small room they were not aware of before, other than the reference in Jefferson's grandson's writings. The room had been sealed off and hidden from plain sight for hundreds of years. The room was about 15 feet by 13 feet. It had a large brick oven in the middle and no windows. But what raised historians' eyebrows the most about the room was its location within the large house. It was very close proximity to Jefferson's personal room, just down the hall. Let's rewind the clock 200 years to the time of Jefferson. A political journalist who wrote for a Richmond newspaper, James T. Callender, wrote an inflammatory report on Jefferson with the intent to slander his name. The primary allegation in the report suggested that Jefferson had started a relationship with a woman after his wife died. In and of itself, that's not too bad of an accusation, but things heated up as Callender further asserted that Jefferson had started a relationship with a slave girl who had been on the plantation from a very young age. Callender referred to the girl as Jefferson's concubine. Callender also stated that Jefferson had children by her, but did not list himself as the father of the children in public record in an attempt to keep his indiscretions hush-hush. By this point in time, rumors had already been swirling that there were people out there who bore an uncanny resemblance to the president. Was it possible that Jefferson's slave bore children in this small windowless room in the house?
Hverdagen kan være hektisk.
Hidden from the rest of the world? Historians believe this is a distinct possibility. If so, who is this mysterious woman, the mother of the Founding Fathers' children? Did this room prove Callender right? There were other contemporaries during Jefferson's time that whispered about his personal affairs. Among these people, the second president of the United States, John Adams. In a letter he wrote to his sons in 1794, 8 years prior to the editorial Callender wrote, Adams appears to be referring to Jefferson's relationship with a slave girl. However, because the references are veiled in Roman myths, historians can't be sure. But one line in particular has stood out as a possible reference to the Jefferson scandal. When considering reasons Jefferson might have resigned his position as Secretary of State, Adams speculates that Jefferson might be summoned from the Familiar Society of Egeria. During the time, familiar was an innuendo for being intimate, and Egeria was a Roman mythical nymph whose story involves her meeting a king in a secret grove. The slave believed to be Jefferson's concubine, as Callender described her, was 16-year-old Sally Hemings. Sally Hemings was the half-sister of Martha Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson's wife. Much of Hemings' life was shrouded in mystery for over 200 years. It wasn't until recently that historians looked a little closer into the life of the woman who lived on the Jefferson plantation in Virginia. Despite her connection to the First Lady, Hemings was dealt a different hand in life. She was half African-American and half white. Unlike Mrs. Jefferson, Sally was born into slavery. She arrived at the Jefferson plantation at a very young age. As such, she was tasked with labor within the Jefferson household. Hemings was described by Jefferson's enslaved blacksmith, Isaac Granger Jefferson, as mighty near white and very handsome. And it was recorded that Sally Hemings had long hair that reached her waist. It was noted around the estate that Hemings received the preferable work and never had to work hard labor outside. She served the Jeffersons until Thomas Jefferson's death in 1826. Historians, however, uncovered hidden information in the mystery room of the Jefferson house that was only a rumor during the Revolutionary period. At 14, the young girl, barely a teen, accompanied Thomas Jefferson to France. 2 years later, Sally Hemings' life would drastically change. Thomas Jefferson was the United States minister to France. In 1794, Jefferson, a recent widower, took a trip to France and took Sally Hemings along with him. France was considered a free country and it was illegal to own slaves while living under the French flag. There's a belief that Hemings had the choice to stay in France, where she could have been protected under the law of the French government. But
the Okia gave her a magnificent and extremely expensive debut. Beating an apprentice would be unthinkable because it risks injury or disfigurement. When Minako was in school, she kept it a secret that she was on the basketball team, as she never would have been given permission to for fear of injury. career, entertaining many celebrities and even royals throughout it, before shocking everybody by retiring at the height of her success when she was only 29. To clear up the misinformation and set her story straight. I was entirely shocked by how much I related to and adored Geisha of Gion, Minako's memoir. Not only is it wonderfully written and a page-turner, but the educational quality of it is amazing. Minako is the first geisha to ever come forward with their story publicly. She explains the intricacies of her former profession so clearly and keeps you interested throughout. And these stereotypes were only pushed further by Memoirs of a Geisha. Worse still than the inaccuracies was Golden directly thanking Minako in the acknowledgements. In Japan, the book was received at best as another Western attempt to portray Japan as some exotic land, and was far from a bestseller. Minako received backlash from her own former industry thanks to the acknowledgements, and lost friendships. After watching the movie adaptation of Memoirs, I did some research and found out about the many controversies surrounding both book and movie. I also discovered a remarkable woman named Minako Iwasaki. She allowed the author of Memoirs of a Geisha, Arthur Golden, to interview her as research for the book, under the impression the story being written would be a perfectly respectful and accurate portrayal of geisha culture. She also had just one condition for this interview, that her name never be attached to the book. You see, this iconic part of Japanese culture has remained a mysterious and secretive world since its beginning, and there is an unspoken rule that geisha never speak publicly about their work. This has caused many misconceptions about what a geisha is to be widespread, and these stereotypes were only pushed further by Memoirs of a Geisha. Worse still than the inaccuracies was Golden directly thanking Minako in the acknowledgements.
Jeg hader Sverige.
Nej, det er løgn. Du elsker Sverige.
Skidte. Pas på med...
Hours of sleep. Tragedy struck in 1960 when one of Yeiko's sons drowned in a canal near Minako's parents' house. Yeiko hated Minako even more after this, and told her she wished it was her who had died. Not wanting to leave her other son in her parents' care, Yeiko broke the women-only rule and moved her son Mamoru into the Iwasaki Okiya, as well as having boyfriends to stay the night. Mamoru was 15 and Minako was 12, and soon he began to harass her and eventually tried to assault her, but was caught in the act just in time by Minako's sister Kuniko, who flew into a rage. Minako had to stay in another Okiya for the next fortnight, while Yeiko and Mamoru were being moved out, but this was not the last time Yeiko would cause her younger sister trouble. Mother Sakaguchi, the owner of the Okiya Minako stayed at, oversaw Minako's artistic progress and was a close associate of the Iwasaki Okiya. She was furious with Yeiko's behaviour and took matters into her own hands. She had Yeiko banned from dancing for 3 years, and the Iamoto of the Inoue school agreed. Yeiko was also forbidden to enter any Okiya associated with the Iwasakis, nor could she send gifts or do the customary greetings and ritual visits. She was also not allowed anywhere near Minako, and was to give up all the duties of an older sister in everything but name. This made sure no one, especially not Minako, was subject to any scandal or dishonour. In order to become a Maiko, each girl has to pass a dance examination at the Inoue school. Minako received the highest score. From then on, she wore the hairstyle of a Maiko and had to sleep with her neck resting on a wooden pillow. Maiko wear a type of kimono called hikizuri. It reveals more of the back of their neck and has a longer train. Children to Anochaya to further their education, and when they are older they sometimes even get jobs working there to build a closer relationship with the establishment and learn how everything works. Soon after her debut, Minako was chosen for the annual poster for the Kimono Dealers Association, as well as being the centerfold photo in the Miyako Adori program. The Miyako Adori means the cherry dances, and is a series of public performances given in April. It is a big tourist event and coincides with the cherry blossoms appearing. An older geiko once stuck the hot end of her cigarette into Minako's hand right in front of a client at an ozashiki. Geiko would tease Minako and try to trick her, and her own older sister Yeiko did the opposite of what an anasan is supposed to by disparaging her to clients. One time she was dragged about on the floor by a customer who'd been put up to it by the other geiko, who all thought it was hilarious and her accessories were always mysteriously disappearing. Minako vowed to become the best dancer she possibly could in the hope of turning malice into admiration, and when she gained enough popularity to do so, she decided to help those who didn't like her by requesting her clients to invite certain geiko to ozashiki, thus earning her rivals' gratitude. On top of the treatment by other geiko, Minako received street harassment from men on her way to engagements, eventually having to take taxis instead of walking for her safety. One night she did meet a kind chairman of an electric company, like the chairman in Memoirs. Yeiko had been saying horrible things about Minako at an ozashiki, and when she went to her next appointment, she was visibly upset. The chairman, named Jiro Ushio, managed to cheer her up. A series of special performances at the new Kabukiza Theatre in Osaka for the month of May, and as soon as that was finished, I was straight into her rehearsal for the Rokagai performances in June. On top of this, Minako would attend as many ozashiki parties as possible, often getting to sleep at only 2 or 3 a.m. and rising at 6. It was around this time Minako began a relationship with an actor named Shintaro Katsu, who was married but told her he would get her divorce. They were together for years before Minako broke it off after realizing he wasn't planning on leaving his wife after all. Later in her career as a
Between 1808, when the United States abolished the transatlantic slave trade, and 1865, when it abolished slavery, enslaved peoples toiled on the plantations of Virginia. Those were not their only sites of labor, however. Enslaved people worked in factories and fisheries, in tobacco processing facilities, and as transporters of produce. The image of slaves working in the tobacco or cotton fields of Virginia is somewhat misleading. But thousands of others were taught skills such as barrel making, tanning of hides, candle and soap making, carpentry, hobbing shoes, meat and fish preservation and packing, and many others. They thus earned. Support of the enslaved workers became the responsibility of the employer, including food and clothing and in many cases shelter. In Virginia, it became standard to hire out enslaved workers for a period of 50 weeks, with New Year's Day being the starting point. January 1st became known as Hiring Day in discussions of Virginia commerce. Domestic workers, cooks, housemaids, seamstresses, and nannies were commonly held positions in which women slaves were hired out to others. Many slave owners demanded that the enslaved workers they hired out be treated fairly and carefully by their employers. An employer who returned a worker in an unhealthy or injured condition could be sued for negligence, or for, in essence, damaging another man's property. By the beginning of the 19th century, the practice of hiring out slaves had become so widespread in Virginia that new business lines emerged, brokerage houses and hiring agents, dedicated solely to the hiring of slaves throughout the state, received commissions for arranging the transactions. Richmond, Virginia became the center of tobacco production, with more than 4 dozen factories manufacturing cigars, pipe tobacco, and chewing tobacco. Nearly 2/3 of the more than
The ships transported the enslaved Africans to places all over the world. The descendants of these Africans make up what is known as the African diaspora, territory, and eventually a state of the United States of America. It also saw the founding of Alachua County and the establishment of the county seat in Throughout all of the changes in the ownership of Florida, the Africans, for the most part, remained enslaved. I am standing in front of the Newtonsville Cemetery.
This interview left me speechless. It's bigger than natural selection and the theory of relativity.
The Untold Stories of the Southwest Florida African American Community is being made possible in part by the Lee County Board of County Commissioners.
On Boca Grande and Sanibel Island, there were African American farmers on Sanibel. They picked the fruit in Alva.
As African American communities grew, churches were built. These buildings became more than just places of worship.
When we talk about the whole African American religion or church movement, it's very important to remember that the slaves brought religion with them. The Christian church that developed here in America is really a syncretism of African religion, some Islamic religion, and then of course the Christianity that was here. Now, the Christianity took hold with the African slaves because of many of the stories that they heard, especially the story of the Israelites and their struggle for freedom to find the promised land. This story was just very, very important to African Americans.
The number of the schools for African Americans were started in the churches. Before the Williams Academy, there were schools operated in the churches. And after Williams Academy, there were classes, kindergarten, first and second grade, held in the churches. So yes, church played a very, very important role, not only in moral growth and stability, but in educational growth and stability.
The first service held in Punta Gorda was an integrated service. They saw no harm in worshiping with black people.
Local communities also benefited from the input of some influential leaders who made lasting contributions.
Dr. Ella Piper was a foot specialist and a beautician. And her clients were all white. She had no black.
Now, we all know slavery is a huge part of Black history. I would go as far as to say world history. I think it's fair to say that it's an integral part of the history of Black people, especially when you consider how they came to be in the UK and America, like mainly. Although I want to say, prior to slavery, this particular type of abuse gained popularity when slave rebellions increased. So when slaves were like, we're not having this, when that kind of increased, that's when the butt breaking increased too. In a sick and twisted way, what they would do is literally strip the slaves down so they were butt naked. They would flog them and then they would rape them. Like literally just sodomize them in front of a crowd. This was a public thing. This was done in front of a crowd, often in front of the slave's family, wife, sons, daughters. Humiliation. That was the overall aim. And as well as being subjected to rape, on occasions, these enslaved men would be forced to have sex with one another too, as you can only imagine. The humiliation was way too much for some slaves. And as a result, they would kill themselves. They would literally kill themselves. And if they didn't kill themselves, it wasn't unusual for someone that had been buck broken to literally just disappear, never to be seen again. It was that deep. The second thing, and I'm really not going to labor on about these because it's a lot, breeding farms. So eventually, like the whole slavery thing got to the point where abolitionists were stepping in. The whole kind of movement to stop slavery was gaining momentum. And as a result, slave ships were stopped. So the flow of slaves reduced dramatically. And obviously that, together with more and more slaves being freed, meant that there was a decline in the availability of slaves. Slave masters had to think of other ways of basically maintaining. They didn't want to let a good thing go. So they came up with this idea of breeding farms. And it's literally what it says on the packet. Breeding farms, a farm to breed slaves. They literally took slaves, slave men that were strong and healthy, and forced them to have sex with women and get them pregnant. The madness is, it did not matter who these women were. They would be forced to have sex with female slaves that were their mothers, their daughters, their sisters. It did not matter to the slave owner. They just wanted more slaves. It's just unbearable to think about.
Did you know that 2 out of every 3 guys are going to experience in a castle in Bavaria, where she resided with a few dozen other girls who had likewise been thoroughly vetted? As for this process, she states it was mostly just showing proof of Aryan ancestry through to your great-grandparents on both sides of your family. She also stated the whole place was in the charge of a professor, a high-up SS doctor who examined each of us very thoroughly as soon as we arrived. We had to make a statutory declaration that there had never been any cases of hereditary diseases, dipsomania, or imbecility in our family. Also noteworthy here is that the girls were made to sign an agreement that any children they had during their time in the program would be property of the state and sent to institutions to be taught Nazi ideology before being given to suitable families. The girls were kept in relative luxury, with facilities for basically anything they wanted, even a movie theatre. Trutz stated of this, "The food was the best I've ever tasted. We didn't have to work, and there were masses of servants." As to the men they were made to socialize with, she states, they were all very tall and strong with blue eyes and blonde hair. We were given about a week to pick the man we liked, and we were told to see to it that his hair and eyes corresponded exactly to ours. When we had made our choice, we had to wait until the 10th day after the beginning of the last period. Noteworthy here is that neither side was to ever know the real names of each other for total anonymity. Also noteworthy is that SS officers involved were not just single men, but a mix of married and not, chosen for their supposed ideal attributes to be the male half of breeding stock for the nation and race. Once the assigned 10th day after the woman's period came, they were examined medically and then told to invite the future father of their child to their room for some spicy time. She states of that, as both the father of my child and I believed completely in the importance of what we were doing, we had no shame or inhibitions of any kind. She also noted her boy toy was incredibly attractive, but seemed remarkably dumb. But nevertheless, for 3 nights running, they got it on, and he also got it on with other girls in the castle who chose him as well, intermixed in there at the same time. And so it was that Trut soon found herself knocked up. Once it was confirmed that she was pregnant, she was taken to a maternity home to bake her baby. As for the actual birthing, she states, it was not an easy birth, for no good German woman would think of having any artificial aid, such as injections to deaden the pain, like they had in the degenerate Western democracies. She was then allowed to keep her baby for 2 whole weeks before he was taken away and she never saw him again. Apparently not at all traumatized by this, after she considered signing up for another go, but soon met an officer in the real world and married him instead.
His features bear no resemblance to my family. I mean, my family look very West African compared with this man here. It strikes me as somebody who was able to deal with running slave plantations and not really blink an eyelid, and makes me feel very, very remote from the white side of my family.
Yet in England in the 1700s, black slaves were seldom more than a step away from their owners. The ultimate status symbol was the household slave, and the height of fashion to be painted with one of your human possessions.
The most fortunate of them were black people who worked in the mansions, in the country houses, because they were fed, they were polished, they were they were brushed down, they were displayed. They were pets, so therefore you look after your pet. The 18th century conversation pieces, as they were called, frequently had black servants in attendance as symbols of wealth, but also as symbols of servitude.
Some black people could flourish in this gilded setting, but others ran away or were abandoned to join a growing underclass of sailors, entertainers, peddlers and thieves, now thronging England's cities.
Many were desperately poor. Many of them were beggars. You have rabbit sellers, you have market sellers, you have fairground performers, you have strolling actresses. They did whatever they could. They were highly visible in many areas of English life.
By the 1770s, there were up to 15,000 black people in England's cities. Among them was one runaway who was to strike the first blow in the battle for freedom. The abolition struggle began almost by accident, sparked by a runaway black servant, one of thousands living in fear of the slave owners.
Runaway sometime since, a Negro lad about 18 years of age answers to the name of Starling, now the property of Ralph Cook at the sign of the Rising Sun in Princes Street, Bristol. Whoever shall harbour or conceal the said black will be prosecuted as the law directs. But any person who will secure him and give notice to his said master Ralph Cook shall receive 1 guinea reward.
Once caught, runaways could be returned by force to their masters. The capture of one former slave was witnessed by a pioneer abolitionist, Granville Sharp.
Granville Sharp, who had nothing to do with slavery, comes across a black boy in the streets who's badly beaten up and makes a simple inquiry, which is like, what's happened? And gets the story. And when he understands the cruelty endured, the suffering endured by ordinary black people in this country at the hands of cruel masters, he decides, like any decent Englishman or Christian, to do something about it. And he spends the rest of his life campaigning for the end of the slave trade.
Sharp managed to prevent the ship's captain from taking the boy, James Somerset, back on board. According to law, he was just a piece of property, but Sharp took his case to court, arguing that Somerset should be a free man.
Cemetery. In fact, the Noonanville Cemetery is the only thing that's really left of the town of Noonanville, which was the first county seat for Alachua County. Noonanville was originally called Dells, and it was named after the planter brothers who established it. The Dell brothers were the largest owners of enslaved Africans in Alachua County. Noonanville was critical to this area. It was a place where the planters and farmers came to trade their goods. The enslaved Africans would bring things to the market to sell. In fact, if it was not their own, they could be beaten, worked, and sold at will. A few had more positive relationships with their owners. Nevertheless, the fact that they were bought and could be sold at will clearly illuminated their degraded status. Today, all that remains of the bustling plantations and farms are trees, grass, and other elements from nature that have crept over the spaces where enslaved laborers left blood, sweat, and tears. A few antebellum houses or portions of houses still stand as a testimony to that era. In fact, there has often been more of a focus on the houses and structures than on the Africans who labored in their shadows. There were no cameras or tape recorders available to document the millions of stories from men, women, children, and elders trapped in the system of slavery. Only in the wind might you hear the collective voices or whispers from the families that were torn apart, the women who could be raped at will, the many people who could be beaten for not following orders or for no reason at all. Some families passed down information through oral histories, while other families learned nothing because the subject was too painful for their relative to share. Selena Rollins, shown in this photo from the Micanopy Historical Society, was enslaved by the Rollins family in Micanopy. This picture was taken after slavery, but it demonstrates the kind of clothes that some of the enslaved women would wear. Men would wear trousers and shirts if they had them. Enslaved people were expected to wear the same clothes over and over again. Some had shoes, but most did not. The enslaved women were seamstresses, quilters, who provided clothes for everyone on the plantations. They also sewed for the planter families. These laborers did every type of work you could imagine. They essentially ran the farms and plantations on which they worked. They were builders, midwives, healers, carpenters, child care providers, animal handlers, inventors, blacksmiths, cooks. The list goes on. They are most known for their work as agriculturalists. They planted, cultivated, and harvested cotton and numerous other crops that were shipped via the train to places around the country. When white planters or farmers faced financial difficulty, they often sold off one of the enslaved laborers to get out of debt. Contrary to what some people have suggested, Africans were not happy and content to live out their lives as slaves.
Captain, keep on hollering, hurry, oh Lordy, I'm gonna take my time. Oh, good God Almighty, man.
They resisted in numerous ways. One way was not to do their assigned work. Another form of resistance was that they would do the work slowly. Some ran away from plantations to live as maroons. They'd run and live with the Seminoles, or sometimes they'd run to a state where they believed they could live freely. An 1864 ad in the newspaper Cotton States is titled "Ran Away." It reads, "From the subscriber near Gainesville, Florida, on the night of the 27th, a Negro man by the name of Edinburgh, black, 5'9" or 10 inches high, came from Jefferson County in this state. I will give a liberal reward for his delivery to me or lodge in jail so that I can get him. James Whaley, June 4th, 1864. Another 1864 Cotton State newspaper ad was placed by none other than Madison Stark Perry, a big planter in Alachua County. He was offering a $400 reward for the capture and deliver of Tillman and Andy, who ran away from his plantation near Micanopy. By 1860, Alachua County had the third largest number of owners of 30 or more enslaved laborers in Florida. Most white residents of the day supported the institution of slavery because it was good for their lives and the economy of their communities. In his letter to the editor of the Tallahassee Sentinel, the former territorial governor of Florida, Richard Call, wrote, "The institution of African slavery has become the great agency of civilization. It is feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, and administering to the wants and necessities of the whole civilized world. It is sending commerce and civilization to barbarous tribes and carrying Christianity into heathen lands." Debates about the merits of slavery took place all the time. Most white Alachua County residents had come to rely on the benefits of the system of slavery, which gave them more rank over blacks. Many things contributed to the start of the Civil War. One factor was the election of Abraham Lincoln to the presidency of the United States. Southerners, for the most part, had come to rely on the labor of enslaved Africans. Livelihood was threatened. Africans looked forward to the possibility of being free. Alachua County fully supported the Confederate cause when Florida seceded from the Union. The county was the site of a few battles during the Civil War. It was a storage site for cattle, corn, rice, and other food that the Confederate soldiers might need. The condition of enslaved Africans did not change during the war, as they were expected to continue working. In fact, their work often increased as they had to help oversee things and assist the plantation wives in the absence of the owners. Some enslaved Africans ran away. Sometimes their masters rented them out to the Confederate cause. Still, others registered to fight for the Union. An article written about one of the 1864 skirmishes appeared in the Chelsea Telegraph. 36 Negroes were brought away from Gainesville. Of these, 33 enlisted, and they mean enlisted in the Union. So much for the theory that enslaved Africans were happy with their condition. The writer also describes the actions of blacks. A house servant brought in an Enfield rifle which his master had set up against a fence while superintending the work of the field hands. Bringing the weapon into the town, he insisted on being allowed by Captain Marshall to strike a blow for liberation of his race.
Det forkerte boliglån kan hurtigt blive en pengesluger. Overvejer du at købe ny bolig, eller?
American school children are taught that slaves in Confederate states were freed when Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation.
I mere end 100 år har danske grise skabt mange arbejdspladser på danske slagterier, men det går den forkerte.
American school children are taught that slaves in Confederate states were freed when Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on September 22, 1862. While true, the reality of actually freeing those slaves was far more complicated. Today, we're going to take a look at what actually happened on plantations when the slaves were freed. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. After that, please leave a comment and let us know what other topics you would like to hear about. Okay, so let's head back to the days after the Civil War. You would think that once freed, the slaves would get off the plantations as fast as humanly possible. But in his autobiography, Booker T. Washington mentioned that many ex-slaves, especially older ones, decided to stay. Although free, these ex-slaves typically made deals with their former masters to work for pay. According to Washington, one by one, the older slaves began to wander from the slave quarters back to the big house to have a whispered conversation with their former owners as to the future. Thomas Rutling was only 9 when he and his fellow slaves learned of their emancipation. He thought freedom would mean his family would now live a life like their former master, but instead, the family chose to stay on the plantation another 2 years. Rutledge, along with his brother and sister, finally left the plantation in 1865. They went to live with a family in Nashville. He later attended the Fisk Free Colored School, which eventually became Fisk University. In her 1909 book, Memories of Childhood Slavery Days, ex-slave Annie L. Burton wrote of her own experiences with emancipation. Annie recalled that when the news reached the Alabama plantation she worked on, every slave who wasn't feeble or sickly left immediately. Some of these younger, healthier ex-slaves even immediately joined the Union Army. However, because their mother had run away, Annie and her younger sisters stayed behind under the care of their mistress. This may not have been the act of charity it appears to be. This same mistress tried to talk her husband into not telling the slaves about their freedom, and then made the feeble and sickly slaves who remained on the plantation work the fields. After the crops were planted, some plantation owners asked their ex-slaves to sign contracts guaranteeing they would work the crops until January. They would then be divided at the fall harvest for payment. Such a deal is mentioned in the Reverend Irving E. Lowry's 1911 book, Life on the Old Plantation in Antebellum Days, or A Story Based on Facts.